I've been asked to speak to you on the subject of opera in England. It, as you may know, is something with which I have been concerned with and interested in the greater part of my life, even from childhood, when at the age of 7 I was taken to my first operatic performance in this city of Liverpool. It was when I was about 17 or 18 that I became, I won't say fully professionally, but almost professionally interested in opera in all its manifestations, associations, connections, and from the technical point of view also. That is to say, not only music, but production, electricity, all the accessories of an opera house, assembled there for the purpose of giving adequate productions of opera. Now, I want to make one thing very clear to you, that from the continental point of view, there is no such thing as opera in England. Taking you back to the middle of the 17th century, when Europe went through a kind of a revolution in musical composition and musical taste, when the public hankered after and obtained, finally, instrumental music in large quantities, in preference to choral music that had been provided in even larger quantities in the preceding century. And a new form was discovered by a group of Italians that we now know as opera. I have to remind you that in all this revolution of invention as well as taste that spread over France, Italy, Germany, Austria, etc., we took no interest, neither took any part at all. By the close of the century, whereas every city on the continent of consequence had more than one opera house, in the great pleasure-giving and pleasure-loving haunt of Venice, as Byron says, the revel of the earth, the mask of Italy, there were no less than 27 different opera houses, all giving different productions of operas. The same thing applied, in less degree, of course, to some French towns and other Italian towns and German cities. In fact, opera was all the go and infinitely the most popular musical entertainment of the time. From that time until the present day, music on the continent, in all countries, with the possible exception of Germany, has been almost synonymous with opera. Whereas music in this country, for the last 250 years, has not been synonymous with opera, and so much so to the contrary that we are not seriously thinking about opera today. That is to say, most of us, or most of the musical public, look upon it as an art form inferior to that of the symphony or the quartet or the oratorio. They look upon all persons connected with opera, principally singers, as strange, weird, unaccountable, and eccentric curiosities. In fact, something rather to be deplored than to be encouraged. You may think that I am overpainting this adverse picture, but let me remind you, we are still in this country without one representative national opera house. Have the great cities of Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Edinburgh theatres devoted to opera? No, they have not. Have they got fairly long opera seasons? They have not. The only town which has opera seasons of any consequence is London. And there is one opera house, but still not a national opera house, because a great deal of its activities are given up to foreign opera and to the agreeable, if less serious, art of dancing. An opera house, even in the sense of the Metropolitan Opera House in New York, is understood, or La Scala in Milan, or the Berlin Opera House. That is to say, a house where native art is not exclusively, but mainly employed and exploited, that we do not yet have in this country. And there appears to be, to my mind, no prospect of having it in the near or the distant future. So much for that. Now we will deal with British composers of opera such as they are. There was a solitary appearance at the end of the 17th century in the almost legendary figure and name of Henry Purcell. Later on, or much later on, we had a long succession of what are known as ballad operas, a species of the art, or let us say the craft, almost peculiar or singular to this country. Strings, long strings of inferior tunes, linked with, if possible, inferior stories and dialogue. An utterly unworthy, I may say, generally speaking, contemptible demonstration of human frailty. It was not until the middle of the 19th century that we did turn out one or two men who tackled the operatic form as understood abroad, and understood at the time, particularly in Italy, by the early Verdi, Donizetti, Bellini, in France, Aubert, the young Gounod, and so on. We did turn out a few people who studied the form seriously and strove to engraft it upon musical life in this country and the taste of the public of the time. I will deal with those composers, there are two or three of them, and one in particular toward the end of my talk. Between the middle of the century and the end of it, other composers sporadically appeared and did occasionally produce one or perhaps two fairly interesting specimens of opera, but they did not remain in the repertoire of opera as heard and seen in this country. They have made very little appeal to their own countrymen, and hardly more to anyone outside. Latterly, there has been again a minor renaissance of interest in opera, but chiefly in this country, but chiefly in the person of one composer. His example has not been very successfully followed up to the moment by anyone else. Now that is the state of things so far as composers are concerned. We have, in the last 100 years, let us say, forgetting for the moment the achievements such as they are of Purcell, we have about 12 English operas, if you like to call them British you can, because they have been written by Scots, Irishmen, and Englishmen, and almost denationalized Englishmen, so perhaps we better call them British. There are about 12 examples that could constitute the nucleus of a national repertoire of opera. Now I come to the latter part of my talk to you, and that which concerns perhaps the most interesting operatic figure of them all. Towards the end of the first part of the 19th century, there arrived upon the scene an Irishman. He was a singer, and a very good singer too. He achieved great success and popularity on the continent as a singer, being a very good musician and being a highly intelligent and cultivated man. He made himself thoroughly acquainted with all there was to be known about the making of an opera and what went on inside an opera house. And his name was Michael Bowes. After a few preliminary trials of opera, some of them by no means contemptible, in spite of what Weber once said to a young man about first operas when he said it's customary to drown the first litter of puppies. In spite of that, the earlier efforts of Balfe are by no means despicable. Operas like Satanella, The Siege of Rochelle, could be easily revived with a little, let's say, modern aid in the way of reorchestration, duplication of certain old-fashioned numbers, and all that sort of thing. A process, I may say, that I have been applying in the last few weeks to the particular opera to which I am going to make reference. It was in 1843 that Balfe produced, to the delight of his countrymen, The Bohemian Girl. The Bohemian Girl had a very curious history prior to the time. I'm speaking of the subject. Prior to the time, Balfe took it up as an operatic subject. It has its origins in a very popular ballet which appeared in Paris, written by a Frenchman in the 30s. A play was produced on this subject, which again became popular. All this Balfe was familiar with. And he took this subject and set it and adapted it to the taste of his countrymen. And The Bohemian Girl that is known in England generally is substantially the opera that Balfe produced in 1843. I say substantially because there is no doubt it wasn't quite the same. But the point is the opera became popular beyond the imagining of anyone today thinking of British opera. It went all over the world. It became as popular in Germany, in France, in Italy, as in England, and of course the New World. It was translated into French, into Italian. And not only that, but Balfe made special arrangements of the opera for the French stage, for the Italian stage, and for the German stage. It's the French version that provides us with the greatest amount of extra interest in this work, because the version that Balfe wrote for the Paris Theatre and rewrote again for the newly built Grand Opera of Paris in 1867 is almost a new work. In other words, the latest version of Balfe himself with this opera is a much grander and more important venture than The Bohemian Girl, as you or any other members of the public have known it in this country since its first performance. It is this version mainly, retaining at the same time all the old and well-loved favorites, all those melodies which have penetrated the consciousness and snared the affections of the British public, that we, that is, say, I and my collaborator, have retained. But we are giving you The Bohemian Girl as a grand opera, the British opera which has had 20 times more success than any other British opera, which maintained itself in the international repertoire for over 60 years, and which I have every intention of restoring to it.